9 Most Terrifying Unsolved Murder Mysteries. Murders send a chill up our spines and force us to consider our own mortality, especially when the murders look like these 9 most shocking murders ever committed. The only thing worse than a murder is an unsolved murder, where the killer likely walks free and the family of the deceased has not been able to find closure. Despite DNA testing and advanced crime scene technologies, police still find it difficult to solve some cases, whether due to lack of evidence or lack of leads or other circumstances. The murders in this list remain unsolved mysteries to this day. From ex-lovers to co-workers to complete strangers, the suspects are varied and diverse. Make sure the lights are on when reading this list of the 9 most terrifying unsolved murder mysteries.
1. Camilla Lyman. If you remove the names, the story of Cam Lyman might sound like a modern-day The Great Gatsby. A reclusive millionaire with a mysterious past, found murdered in water. A case shrouded in mysterious circumstances. A gargantuan, maze-like house where a body can be hidden for almost 10 years with no one the wiser. Cam Lyman is not Jay Gatsby. He was born on September 4, 1932, as Camilla Lyman and died sometime between 1987 and 1995. Although Cam was born female, in 1968, he began identifying as a man and his name to Cam. There is no record of Cam receiving gender reassignment surgery, but he was known to be taking steroids. Cam spent his life breeding dogs and was known as one of the best in his field, known especially well for his Clumber Spaniels. Although there is no clear narrative for the murder, I will try to create a cohesive story based on the research I was able to find. Cam's estate was over 40 acres, and he lived with up to 60 dogs at once, so it made sense that he had a staff that helped tend to the ground, the house, and his many dogs. In 1985, Cam hired George O'Neill. The two formed a fast friendship, which was not usual for Cam. He was known for only leaving the house for dog-related work events, and visits from friends or family members were incredibly rare. Shortly after forming this friendship, Cam gave George the authority to pick up his mail, cash his checks, and become his power of attorney, which meant George had power of Cam's financial and legal matters. Very little else is known all about Cam from this period in his life, and his family had little contact with him. It wasn't until Christmas, 1987, that Cam's family began to worry because Cam's sisters never received their annual Christmas card from him. In fact, they hadn't heard from Cam in months. An investigation was opened. When the staff of the house was interviewed, George O'Neill explained that Cam had traveled to Europe for gender reassignment surgery, although he couldn't provide any proof and could not explain why he hadn't mentioned this to anyone but his wife for 6 months. The investigation was eventually ended, as no one could prove that Cam did not willingly leave his home for Europe. George was eventually convicted of embezzling $15,000 from Cam. He was fined $450 and spent a year in prison for his crime. In 1985, Cam's family decided to declare him legally dead to ensure that his fortune would not go into the wrong hands. Cam's sole beneficiary was the American Kennel Club's Museum of the Dog. The case changed dramatically in 1985, when a body was found in a septic tank in Cam's Hopkinton, Rhode Island home by the new owners that had recently purchased the house. It took over a year to identify Cam's body. Aside from dental records, it was nearly unrecognizable. George O'Neill died on July 11, 2011. There has been no conviction for Cam's murder. Until Cam's body was found, George maintained that Cam was still alive, claiming that he was in Europe. Rosemary Healy, George's attorney, finally made a statement to the press about his attitude. Maybe George hates to think of her as dead. And maybe George did hate to think of his friend, Cam, as dead. Maybe the missing money, the jewelry, the months that George spent ignoring Cam's disappearance, can all be explained. Maybe the police's lack of conviction can be explained by the absence of DNA evidence and the confusion behind when Cam was actually killed. Maybe Cam's murder and the lack of a conviction can be explained by reasons outside of his wealth and gender. And maybe it can't.
2. Mario Amato. The town of Rosarito Beach, Mexico, lies only 25 miles south of San Diego, California, just below Tijuana. It's known for its beautiful sunsets and romantic beaches. That's why two Los Angeles couples headed there one summer weekend in June of 1992. But their vacation soon turned into a deadly nightmare. Less than 24 hours after arrival, one of them, Mario Amato, was arrested after a fight with his girlfriend. 2 hours later, he was dead. The local authorities claimed that he committed suicide. His brother, Joe Amato, thinks differently. I say it was murder, plain murder, and I knew that from the beginning, because I know my brother very well. They stole his life away from him. And we're going to get to the bottom of this. Mario and Joe Amato arrived in Rosarito Beach at 1 a.m. on June 6, 1992, ready to party. Mario's girlfriend, whom we'll call Paula, provided the condo. Joe and his girlfriend, Debbie, were just happy to be invited. The two couples quickly broke out of tequila. They partied through the night, and around 4 a.m., Joe and Debbie went to bed. They awoke at around 7 a.m. to find Mario and Paula still awake, arguing. Mario told Joe and Debbie that he wanted to go home. Debbie was worried. I felt very disturbed, because I know Mario liked this girl very much, and he wouldn't have wanted to leave if it wasn't something serious. By late the next morning, Mario and Paula had apparently made up. It was the last time Joe would see his brother alive. I can still remember the expression on his face. He seemed very happy, like nothing was wrong. That afternoon, Joe and Debbie took a long romantic drive along the coast. Meanwhile, back at the condo, Mario and Paula got in another heated argument on the front porch. Police soon arrived at the scene. Mario was arrested for public drunkenness and disorderly conduct, and taken to the police station. He was placed in a holding cell, but was never formally charged with a crime. At around 6:30 p.m., Joe and Debbie returned to the beach house. To their surprise, nobody was home, and there was no key under the mat. A housekeeper explained that there had been trouble a few hours earlier. Debbie crawled through a window to get inside the condo. Almost immediately, 4 police officers from Tijuana showed up. They asked for Paula by name. Debbie was immediately suspicious. A little later, Mario's girlfriend comes just waltzing in the house. Like nothing was wrong. We asked her where Mario was. She said she didn't know. 2 hours after Paula returned, a group of detectives arrived looking for a relative of Mario's. Joe still had no idea that his brother had been arrested. The detectives informed him that his brother Mario was dead. I was hoping they had made a mistake, and I was just in disbelief that this could be happening. Detectives took Joe to identify Mario's body. When he got there, he noticed that Mario was not wearing a shirt. The detectives claimed that Mario used his shirt to kill himself. Joe didn't believe it. I said, "Oh no, you can kill yourself with a sweater." So I asked, "Wasn't anybody in the jail that would have stopped him from doing this?" He said no, they were all sleeping. 4 guys sleeping at 5:30 in the afternoon? I just couldn't believe that. Mario Amato died 3 months before his 30th birthday. The Mexican authorities refused to release his body until after their autopsy. Joe was forced to return to the United States without his brother. Within a week, the Mexican autopsy was complete. It listed the cause of death as a loss of oxygen to the brain, the result of Mario hanging himself. Joe believed that was ridiculous and contacted Congressman Howard Berman, who did some digging. The Mexican autopsy confirmed the report of the gaolers in Tijuana, that Mario Amato had hung himself with his own sweater. This is the oldest excuse for a jail murder, that the prisoner hung himself. As soon as Mario's body was returned to the United States, Joe hired a pathologist to do a second autopsy. This examination revealed internal injuries to Mario's liver, strong evidence he had been punched in the upper abdomen. The report stated that with such injuries, the victim would not likely have been able to hang himself. Ultimately, the Los Angeles County coroner reviewed both the American and Mexican autopsy reports. He determined that Mario Amato had probably been murdered. There is another disturbing aspect to this case. Mexican authorities violated international agreements by not contacting the U.S. consulate as quickly as possible following Mario's death. Congressman Berman suspected a cover-up. The people involved in this incident did not want authorities coming quickly to the scene of the crime. They wanted the period of time to elapse. They hoped that Joe Amato would forget about it, that his brother was dead, and that he'd go back to the United States and drop the whole issue. Joe Amato remains determined to find the person or persons behind his brother's death. Congressman Berman wrote to the President of Mexico and eventually got the case opened. Mario's body was exhumed. This time, a new autopsy found enough evidence to call the death a murder. Soon after, a Mexican police officer was arrested, tried and convicted of Mario's murder. However, his conviction was overturned 4 months later and he was released. To date there are no new suspects and the case is still unsolved.
3. Jamie Santos. On October 28, 1991, an emergency operator in Wheeling, Illinois, received a troubling call. The caller gave the operator the address of a young woman who wasn't breathing. However, he refused to give his name and said he was calling from a payphone. Authorities arrived to the scene moments later and discovered that the anonymous caller was right. 27-year-old Jamie Santos wasn't breathing. She had been smothered with a pillow and could not be revived. Police now believe that the unidentified caller holds the key to solving a murder. Jamie lived just down the road from her family. According to her mother, Dottie, calls and visits were frequent. She was just like a burst of energy. When she walked in, you knew she was there. Her presence would just radiate. Jamie used her natural good looks to earn a steady income. She pulled in more than $1,000 a week dancing for exclusive parties in and around Chicago. Jamie's father, Pete, was initially troubled by his daughter's provocative career choice. When Jamie first told us that she was going into dancing entertainment, it was a little difficult to handle. Our main concern really wasn't the type of work she was doing, but it was for her safety. Once she reassured us that she'd have somebody accompanying her at all times, the driver or bodyguard, we felt a little bit more comfortable. On Sunday, October 27, 1991, Jamie didn't feel well. She cancelled her bookings, rented a couple of movies, and called a friend. That is all that is known all about the last night Jamie Santos was alive. The call for help came the following morning. Paramedics found Jamie in her bedroom. There were signs of a struggle, yet Jamie's head was carefully propped on a pillow. She had not been raped. There were no eyewitnesses, fingerprints, or anything that would yield a DNA profile. According to William Benson, a detective for the Wheeling Police Department, the only lead was the male voice on the 911 tape. There's a possibility the 911 caller could be an innocent bystander that stumbled upon this. There's evidence of a struggle. Possibly, somebody could have heard a struggle. Possibly, somebody could have seen somebody running from the area and seen an open door. The 911 caller could be afraid to come forward, thinking that they'll be accused of being the killer, when, in fact, they were a bystander. But in a case as perplexing as this one, Detective Benson envisioned the possibility that the 911 call was made by the killer himself. We don't have evidence that there was forced entry, so there's a good chance the person was an invited guest. Could be a crime of passion. It could have been something that started out innocently and turned bad. It could have been a domestic type argument. Things went too far, and when the person realized that he had hurt Jamie, he had remorse. He put a pillow under her head. He made an honest effort to get medical help for her. Authorities believed that if the killer knew Jamie Santos, he may have met her while she was working as an exotic dancer. Perhaps one of Jamie's clients couldn't take no for an answer. Perhaps one of her drivers had been nursing a secret passion that flared out of control. But still one question remains. Who killed Jamie Santos?
4. Dick Hanson. Dick Hanson was the victim of a fatal shooting near San Jose, California. After a night out with Jean, a female friend, he was sitting in his pickup truck on the side of the street talking when Jean noticed a man pull up and park behind them. Having already commented on the fact that there were only 2 cars left on the street, she noted the man was parked beside a mailbox behind them, and asked Dick if he thought they should move up a bit to give him more room, but he disagreed as the man had plenty. However, he sat in his car the whole time they were talking, and when they were ready to go, Jean agreed to follow Dick in her car because she was unfamiliar with the area. When they each left in their separate vehicles, the man behind them also did so. He continued to follow them for quite some distance even after they pulled onto a highway. Jean even changed lanes a number of times thinking she could outwit him, but to no avail. Feeling spooked, She finally pulled over beside Dick's truck and asked him to go to the police because of the relentless man, but he couldn't hear her and told her to follow him off at the next exit. She reported that the man followed them both off the highway, even though she nearly missed the exit. When they pulled over, she pointed him out in his car, and Dick went back to confront him. Jean saw the man gesture toward her car when he asked him what he wanted. He then stepped back and shouted at him. It was then that he fired his gun at him. Jean frantically rushed back to see if she could help, then froze in fear just staring at the man who stared back at her for a few seconds before taking off into the night. Unfortunately, Dick was dead by the time paramedics arrived. Jean speculates that his stature resembling that of a football player and her license plate number 49 are Hugs, in reference to the San Francisco 49ers, might have gotten Dick killed by a fanatical fan of a rival team. The man has never been identified and the case remains unsolved.
5. Arnold Darkembe and Ruby Bruguier. Arnold Darkembe, 20, and Ruby Bruguier, 19, were a teenage couple and the parents of an infant daughter in 1992. On December 12, 1992, the couple and Ruby's cousin, Tracy DeYoung, 17, were involved in a horrible car accident in Lake Andes, South Dakota where they lived. The driver, Arnold, suddenly steered the car into a frozen ditch. The cousins, Tracy and Ruby, were inside the overturned car while Arnold was nowhere to be found. Ruby managed to escape, but didn't help Tracy out of the car for whatever reason. Luckily, paramedics arrived a short time later and managed to pull Tracy out of the car and save her life. Tracy stated all three had been drinking the night of the car accident. Police Deputy Billy Youngstrom conducted a search for Ruby and Arnold as soon as he could, but they were nowhere to be found the night of the accident. In early March 1993, a passing driver saw a body in the frozen ditch where Arnold's car had crashed months earlier. Ruby Bruguier's decomposed body laid in the frozen ditch. Ruby's glasses and shoes were nowhere to be found, but her clothes remained intact. The police pumped the ditch out and at noon the next day they found Arnold's body submerged in the water, about 15 feet away from where Ruby was found. Arnold's body wasn't as decomposed as Ruby's was. His skin color was fine, he wasn't frozen to the ground and neither were his clothes. Police didn't understand how both bodies were in two very different stages of decomposition when it was assumed they died at the same time. It was expected that Ruby and Arnold would have decomposed at the same rate. An autopsy later determined that both victims died of exposure. A witness claimed to have seen Arnold and 3 other people on New Year's Eve, almost 3 weeks after the car accident. The witness even took a polygraph exam and passed, which indicated she hadn't lied about seeing Arnold on New Year's Eve. Ruby's father, Quentin Bruguier, believed that his daughter and her boyfriend were victims of foul play and that the killer murdered them elsewhere and put the bodies back in the ditch to make it seem like they died there. It is still unknown if the young lovers were victims of a homicide or an accident. A $5,000 reward is being offered in the case.
6. Jack Davis Jr. Forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht can read a dead body the way most people read a book. Wecht has performed some 14,000 autopsies and consulted on or reviewed another 30,000, including the autopsies of Elvis Presley and John Bennett Ramsey. Dr. Wecht was also called as an expert witness by the Congressional Committee investigating the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Although Dr. Wecht is often involved in the most high-profile and controversial cases, he has also assisted smaller-scale investigations. Among those was the suspicious death of Jack Davis, Jr., a student at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Authorities found Jack's body on a Wednesday evening. He was sprawled at the bottom of a stairwell next to a classroom building. Jack had last been seen the previous Friday at a party with some of his fraternity brothers. Jack's body was autopsied by a local pathologist. The results were sent to County Coroner Thomas Streams. This is how Streams described his ruling that Jack's death was accidental. The body was not in disarray from a fight. There was no sign of defensive wounds, as a struggle. There were no drag marks. There was just nothing remarkable about the body. The scenario was that Mr. Davis wandered down into the stairwell in an intoxicated state, perhaps to urinate, collapsed in an unconscious state, vomited, inhaled the vomitus into his lungs, which therefore then subsequently caused his death. The official report concluded that Jack died early Saturday morning, several hours after he was last seen. According to the official account, Jack's body remained in the stairwell for nearly 5 days. From his death on Saturday morning until his body was discovered on Wednesday evening, Jack's family doubted the official determination. When the local journalists began publicly questioning the ruling, the family turned to Dr. Wecht for a second opinion. Even before he began his forensic workup, Dr. Wecht found problems with the official scenario. I was puzzled as a matter of common sense. How could a body have been lying outside on a college campus for 5 or more days unseen, unnoticed by anybody? The other thing that puzzled me was I thought, gee, why would a young man in the early hours of the morning walk 15 steps down the landing, and another 5 steps to urinate? I remember when I went to college, and I remember what young men will do when they have to urinate, if they are inebriated. Not too many people have that kind of discretion and personal sensitivity. So that did not fit either. Dr. Wecht soon found discrepancies in the toxicology report. Jack was known to be drinking heavily on the night he supposedly died, yet absolutely no alcohol was found in his blood. Dr. Wecht knew that was scientifically impossible if he died on Saturday morning. Whatever level you have at the time of your death will be the level that will be found later on. In order for him to have wound up with no alcohol in his blood at the time of death, he would have had to have been alive for about 30 hours. The fact, then, that there was no alcohol in his blood, indicates to me that he did not die at that time when they theorized he had fallen down the steps. That extra 30 hours would put Jack's death on Sunday afternoon, not Saturday morning. Dr. Wecht found additional evidence that indicted the official story. Jack had been clean-shaven Friday night when he was last seen, but when his body was found, there was heavy stubble on his face. He had to have been alive for a significant time, perhaps days, beyond Saturday morning in order for his beard to grow. And, Dr. Wecht described one final discrepancy. The autopsy slides of Jack's lungs proved that the young man could not possibly have choked to death on regurgitated food. If you're going to list that as a cause of death, you've got to find food particles deep down inside the small terminal air passageways, and that wasn't present. The other thing about the autopsy that really stood out for me was the fact that the head had not been examined. The pathologist who did the autopsy had not opened up the cranial vault. After hearing Dr. Wecht's initial findings, Jack's family considered bolder action. Jack's mother, they're thinking, we all agreed, as a family and with Dr. Wecht, that the body needed to be exhumed. It was the only way we would find out the true cause of death. After performing the autopsy, Dr. Wecht proposed an entirely different cause for Jack's death. When I opened up the skull, I found 3 fractures, 3 areas of skull fracture with significant bleeding overlying the brain. It's a blood clot. It's a pooling of blood. And that was the cause of death, which had never been appreciated because the head had never been examined in the first autopsy. Dr. Wecht also investigated the alleged site of Jack's death, the stairwell where his body was found. Wecht wanted to see if the location could somehow validate the official finding that Jack had died from a fall in the stairwell. Wecht's personal observations confirmed his doubts about the stairwell scenario. I realized that that body could not have accidentally fallen or been thrown from high up, because he would have had eggshell, depressed type fractures. Similarly, it did not appear that he had stumbled down the steps, because there was no pattern of abrasions and bruises, and so that did not fit. Dr. Wecht then visited a classroom located directly above the stairwell where Jack's body was found and looked out the window. Some 200 students had passed through the rooms during that time. The view of the stairwell was unobstructed. Yet not a single student had reported seeing a body. There was one final problem with the official finding of accidental death. During the 2 days before Jack's body was found, heavy rain fell on the campus. Yet, Jack's clothing was bone dry. To Dr. Wecht, that was another glaring inconsistency in the official finding. Jack's clothes were not wet. I would say it is more likely that Jack Davis died elsewhere or was injured elsewhere and then was placed at the bottom of those steps. I base this upon the known facts. Others have come to the same conclusion as Dr. Wecht. Local journalists Marlene Brennan and Sharon Santos investigated the death. Brennan theorizes that Jack may have been caught up in a feud between 2 rival fraternities. Some students report that there were up to 5 fights that night. And it could be possible that he was involved in one of them and he was injured and someone didn't know what to do with him. So they kept him somewhere thinking he might get better, and he didn't, and then they moved him to the stairwell. Local authorities have not changed their findings in the case. But based on the forensic evidence amassed by Dr. Cyril Wecht, Jack's family remains convinced he died in an entirely different manner. They remain equally convinced that someone who attended Indiana University of Pennsylvania knows what happened. They are hoping that someone will come forward.
7. Ron Gillespie. For years, the residents of an Ohio town were plagued by messages that revealed their darkest secrets. Who held the poison pen to this handwritten mystery? In 1976, the citizens of Circleville, Ohio began receiving sinister handwritten letters. The anonymous author knew many personal details about each resident and claimed to be watching them. They were postmarked from nearby Columbus, without a return address. The most dangerous letters were directed at Mary Gillespie. The Circleville letter writer accused the local bus driver of having an affair with a superintendent of schools. "I know where you live," read one of the threatening missives. "I've been observing your house and know you have children. This is no joke. Please take it serious." Shortly thereafter, Mary's husband Ron received a letter. Whispers of the illicit affair spread through the once quiet town. Then a new letter arrived at the Gillespie door. "Gillespie, you have had 2 weeks and done nothing. Admit the truth and inform the school board. If not, I will broadcast it on CBS, posters, signs, and billboards, until the truth comes out." Surely this malevolent scribe was someone close to the Gillespie household. Mary and Ron gathered with their loved ones, including Ron's sister and his sister's husband, Paul Fraser, to discuss possible suspects. The letters stopped briefly in 1977. Then, on August 17th, Ron received a phone call that infuriated him. The man burst out the front door and climbed into his car, armed with his gun. He would never return home again. Later that day, authorities found Ron's car wrapped around a tree, with Ron's body inside. Strangely, his gun had been fired, but the reason why remained a mystery. Circleville authorities ruled his death an accident caused by alcohol, a decision that upset the Circleville writer. Soon new letters surfaced accusing the sheriff of a cover-up. A local journalist reported that, according to police records, Ron Gillespie died with 1.5 times the legal limit of alcohol in his system. According to close friends, however, Ron was not a heavy drinker. Eventually, Mary and her lover confirmed the affair, though they claimed their relationship started only after the letters began. Notes continued throughout 1983, with some addressed to Mary's daughter. That year, the anonymous wordsmith even took to installing signs along Mary's bus route for the world to see. Tired of the harassment, Mary pulled over, climbed out of her bus, and went to rip down one sign. But to her shock, she found it was rigged to a box with a string. Upon opening the box, Mary found a gun pointed right at her. Terrified, she reported the incident. Police examined the firearm. While the serial number was partially scratched off, it was still traceable. The weapon belonged to Mary's former brother-in-law, Paul Fraser. Paul was adamant of his innocence, yet with the firearm as evidence and an inconclusive test comparing his penmanship to the threatening letters, authorities believed they had their man. They arrested him for attempted murder. On October 24, 1983, Paul stood trial for the attempted murder of Mary Gillespie. While Paul was not officially accused of being the Circleville letter writer, the prosecution repeatedly brought up the inconclusive results of his handwriting test to cast guilt on the man. Right or wrong, the jury connected the dots. They found Paul guilty of attempted murder, and the judge handed down a maximum sentence of 7 to 25 years. Circleville breathed a sigh of relief. Surely the letters would stop now, right? Wrong. New letters arrived from Columbus, even though Paul was locked away behind bars in another town, with part of his sentence spent in solitary confinement. What's more, Paul received his own letter, while he was in prison. To Paul, the Circleville letter writer wrote, "Now when are you going to believe you aren't going to get out of there? I told you 2 years ago. When we set 'em up, they stay set up. Don't you listen at all?" Paul served a decade in prison and was finally released in May of 1994. By then, reports of threatening letters ceased in Circleville. Paul maintained his innocence until his death in 2012. To this day, the unsolved case of the Sir Cleville letter writer attracts speculation. Was Paul really the man behind the poison pen? Could Mary somehow have been involved? Was there a formal cover-up as the anonymous author alleged? The truth remains a mystery.
8. Blair Adams. I recently began listening to an excellent podcast by Richard McLean Smith called Unexplained. In his show, Smith details a different historical event each episode that, well, just cannot be explained. After listening to a few episodes, I began to wonder if there were any bizarre cases that had occurred in East Tennessee. Cases that, despite all attempts to make sense of what happened, no concrete explanation could be given. After a quick search, I found exactly the type of story I was looking for, and it had occurred right in one of the cities I call home, Knoxville, Tennessee. This story begins in 1996 in British Columbia, Canada's westernmost province, and centers on a young man named Blair Adams. Blair worked as a foreman at a construction company, and was characterized by co-workers, friends, and family as a generally friendly and cheerful guy. But in the summer of 1996 this began to change, as Blair was described as having frequent and wild mood swings and becoming noticeably anxious to the point where he was losing sleep. His unusual behavior came to tipping point on Friday, July 5, 1996. That Friday, Blair rushed to the bank and emptied out his accounts and his safety deposit box, withdrawing over $6,000 in cash and thousands more in jewelry, gold, and other valuables. On Sunday, Blair attempted to enter the United States but was stopped at the border. The unusual amount of cash and valuables he had made border officials suspicious that he was a drug trafficker. After being turned away, Blair headed to the airport, where he purchased an airplane ticket to Frankfurt, Germany. Only hours after purchasing the ticket, Blair arrived unannounced and in a panic at a friend's house. There, Blair begged his friend to help him cross into the United States, as he was terrified someone was after him and trying to kill him. His friend, however, was unable to help him. That Tuesday, the day his flight was scheduled to leave, Blair went to the airport, had his ticket refunded, and rented a car. He once again headed for the border, where this time he managed to get through and entered the U.S. After arriving in the U.S., Blair drove his car to Seattle and purchased a ticket for the first plane leaving the Seattle airport. This flight took Blair to Washington, D.C., where he arrived early on Wednesday morning and then rented another car and began to drive to Knoxville. The first confirmed sighting of Blair in Knoxville was at a gas station around 5 p.m., where he asked an attendant for help with his car troubles. The attendant quickly found that the problem with the car was that the key Blair was trying to use did not go with the car he was driving. Blair and the attendant searched the car and surroundings for the correct key, but their search was unsuccessful. Blair arranged to have the car towed until a rental company could get him another key, and he headed to a local hotel to stay the night. At the hotel, his strange behavior continued as cameras in the lobby filmed him entering and exiting the building 5 times before approaching the desk and finally paying for a room. An employee later noted that Blair had seemed agitated and paranoid, constantly looking behind himself. Immediately after purchasing the room, Blair left the hotel before ever going to his room. Blair exited the hotel at 7:37 on the night of July 10th, and that was the last time he would ever be seen alive. The next morning, Blair Adams' body was found in a parking lot only a half-mile away from his hotel. He was found with his shirt torn open, his pants removed, and his socks turned inside out. Strewn around his body was $4,000 cash in a mixture of American, Canadian, and German currency, along with a bag full of gold and jewelry. His body was covered with cuts and bruises, and a later autopsy report revealed he had been killed by a blow to the abdomen that ruptured his stomach. Blair Adams' murderer was never found. I found this to be such a bizarre story, and the fact that it ended here in Knoxville made it that much more interesting. The most rational explanation for Blair's unusual behavior is that he had quite simply lost his mind, and was suffering from a severe attack of paranoia. Even the police believed his fear of being murdered was just a delusion he had created in his head. But if it was just a delusion, then the craziest part is that it actually came true. It is unlikely that he was the victim of a random violent crime, because why would a random attacker leave a small fortune scattered around his body? Why would a random attacker remove his clothes in such a strange way? If his fears of being murdered were actually warranted, then how could anyone have possibly followed him on his quick and unpredictable journey from British Columbia to Knoxville? Or what could Blair have been running from that could easily track him across a continent? And how did Blair suddenly not have the correct key at the gas station for his car after driving it all day? This story makes no sense no matter how you turn it, and ultimately the mystery surrounding the death of Blair Adams will likely remain unexplained.
9. Will Hedrick. A popular theater student disappears from a party and is later found dead. The University of Idaho sits in the picturesque rural setting of Moscow, Idaho. Little happens out of the ordinary here, so when the local university student suddenly disappeared, the town was in shock. On an early January morning in 1999, Will Hedrick mysteriously vanished without a trace. At 25, Will Hedrick seemed very happy about where he was headed. He was well liked in the theater department and had a good job on campus. Some believed his disappearance was related to the fact that he was openly gay. But all that was known was that he disappeared after a college party. That evening began with hard work. Will and his partner of 5 years, Jerry Schutz, were remodeling their kitchen. Will decided he wanted to go to Katie's party. I didn't want to go. I wanted to go to sleep. And at about midnight, he said, "Okay, I'm going to go and I'll be home in a few hours." When Will arrived at his friend Katie Payne's house, 2 parties were in full swing. On the 3rd floor there were mostly former athletes from the local high school. According to Katie, her party on the 2nd floor was for her friends from the college theater department. Because of the 2 different worlds that were kind of colliding that night, my concern was that there could be a possibility for some sort of confrontation, since Will has no problem being open with how he is and with every opinion. Throughout the night, Will was concerned about another friend, Karen. Karen was having trouble with her boyfriend, a local resident who was attending the 3rd floor party. According to Will's friend, Kathy Sprague, Will would often become belligerent if he had too much to drink. If somebody yelled a slur at him, he'd respond. He takes the bait. By about 2:30 a.m., Karen had gone home, leaving Katie to keep Will from getting into trouble, and then I thought I want to make sure that Karen got home okay, so I called her house, found out that she was okay, found out she was asleep, and I walked back outside onto the porch, and Will was gone. Katie noticed Will's car was still parked out front and assumed he had gone upstairs. By the next morning, the car was gone. Will's partner, Jerry, was immediately concerned when Will didn't come home. It was about 11:30, 12 o'clock when I called Katie's, and I said, "Can you wake Will up and send him home? We've got some stuff to do today." And she said, "Well, he's not here. He didn't stay here last night." And I started calling around to all the theater students, trying to find out if he'd gone to somebody else's house, continued drinking, passed out on their couch. And nobody had seen him. When Will hadn't shown up by Monday morning, nearly 36 hours after the party, his friends combed the city searching for him. A big break came when they found his car parked on a downtown street. Jerry examined the car and was surprised to find it was unlocked and that Will had left his portfolio inside. That portfolio carried all of Will's artwork, his drawings, his makeup sketches. Everything that was important to him was in that portfolio. On the dashboard were his work keys from the university. According to Dan Weaver, chief of the Moscow Police Department, Will's car was thoroughly searched for any evidence that may have suggested foul play. We did go through the car with a fine-tooth comb with crime lab folks. There wasn't any blood or any hair samples that weren't Will's. There wasn't anything in there that would indicate that any kind of foul play occurred, at least in the car. Finding the car only raised more questions about Will's disappearance. Will's friend, Kathy Sprague, thought it was possible that Will left voluntarily to start a new life. Will had a lot of trepidation about school, and I think he shared that with me because we had that in common. Sometimes you just get overwhelmed, and his comment was, "I'd like to tour country. I'd just like to take off someday." I was like, wow. And not tell anyone? No. I said, not even your parents? You know, what about your commitments? He's like, no, I'd just go. But Katie Payne was not as optimistic. She believed that Will's sudden disappearance was somehow related to the events that took place in her apartment building the night of her party. My hypothesis, I guess you should say, is that something happened, and it got out of control. And it probably didn't mean to happen, but then whatever happened got covered up simply because it became so huge. Jerry believed the car might hold the most important clues to Will's disappearance. When the police released the car, he discovered disturbing details. I found out that there was mud caked on the inside wheel wells of the car. So, there was no reason for mud to be caked on the inside of the wheel wells. And then the other odd thing was that somebody had moved the seat all the way to its far back position, indicating to me that a large person may have been the last person to drive Will's car. Desperate for answers, Jerry pursued a theory that someone they both knew might have crossed Will's path early that January morning. 2 months prior to Will's disappearance, Jerry had fired a van driver who worked for his shuttle service. According to Jerry, the man became angry and used a sexual slur. He subsequently went to work for a long-haul trucking outfit. And on the morning of Will's disappearance at approximately 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, he checked out a refrigerated truck from the dispatch in Lewiston, 30 miles south of here. There is a coincidence there in that the last time Will was seen was about the time this driver would have been going to Lewiston. More than 2 years after Will disappeared, 2 hunters found his skull and jawbone in a rural area outside Moscow, Idaho. No other remains were found. The cause of death could not be determined, but police believe Will was murdered. They also suspect that Will knew his attacker,